Previously, I think I've read that you said that understanding Axis allows you to understand Jeff Mills. And you've also said, to quote, theories and subjects of substance fuel the minds within the axis. When and why did you decide on that conceptual composite, let's say, for your music?
Yeah, it was shortly after I left Underground Resistance, and I was thinking about the idea of starting a record label. I was in New York during a residency at the Limelight, and I wanted to take the time to think about how I would structure the company or the label to last. Or
and what year was this?
This was 1992, and the end of '92, winter of '92, going into '93, and I thought that maybe it's a wise time before I introduce the label, begin to start releasing material, that I should kind of narrow in on a certain direction in which it would kind of ride with time. The ideas of the label, the label structure would actually ride on time. So as I got older, I would not feel like maybe I was too old to compose electronic music for people. Mm. So I thought that the label itself should have basically the same mentality, the same character, the same form as myself, meaning it should focus on ideas that I think are interesting, or maybe someone might find interesting. Kind of like having a conversation, and it's like, hey, I heard this really interesting thing on the news today, or I read this interesting thing in the paper, but through music on CD or on vinyl, that type of situation. So I laid out like a structure of how the label should actually look. I tend to like darker colors. Mm-hmm. At the time I was really into very rich colors like gold and very pure colors like black and white. So I chose those three colors as the basis, and I knew that it would be. I had a desire to make more than one particular style of music. So rather than trying to put all these different styles on one particular label, I knew that eventually I would create other sections of the label, which led me to the design of the logo and then the name, actually. So I knew that it would be multiple things revolving around one particular point. And I looked that up, and it came up. I seen Axis, and then from there I created the logo. And so the logo was actually created before I even created the labels. So I'm actually making my way around the logo. So there are three labels now: Axis, Purpose Maker, and Tomorrow. And I haven't approached the fourth and last label yet.
It seems that sometimes a personality is given, or maybe even demands, a kind of demigod status or a pedestal position. What I was wondering is what you find wrong about that pedestal position for a DJ.
Well, I mean, it's really easy for me to discuss because I come from an era where the DJ wasn't looked at in that position. I mean, I come from an era when a DJ was the guy in a booth, kind of tucked away in the corner. Though the people acknowledged him because he was the one controlling the music on the night, but the party was in another direction. It was amongst the people themselves. They used to face each other on the dance floor. It wasn't about what the DJ was playing. You would only be surrounded by other DJs interested in knowing what the song was, and then they would go back to to the party. You would really have very little contact throughout the night. So it's easy for me to see how that evolved and how the DJ is perceived today. And what I think is wrong is that I think, well, I don't think anything is really wrong, but I think that a lot of this persona of what a DJ is supposed to have today is actually, I don't think we as DJs really asked for that. It was something that was kind of created in the media to kind of excite the readers and to kind of create a situation where you have a person that kind of acts as a leader of a certain type of genre or subculture. So they created like the situation where these DJs are actually the ones that are kind of leading the people. And it was I mean, DJing here in America, growing up, there were DJs that we looked up to because they were known for being great DJs technically and theory-wise. People like Larry Levan and Ron Hardy, and I mean, these were DJs that were actually laying foundation for a whole dance culture. But when I went to Europe, I discovered that they have a different structure. And the first thing that I noticed in Europe was that each country has a shelf structure of DJs. There was a number one DJ in every country, and then number one, number two, and number three DJ. And I couldn't quite understand how they could determine who was the number one, because me being a DJ myself, every night can be different. You can have a good night, you can have a bad night. I wasn't quite sure how they were actually accounting for this type of structure, and it was something much different from what we had here, And later, then I kind of found out that they really needed to actually have this. So it was the number one DJ in Germany and the number one DJ in Paris, Laurent Garnier, and the number one DJ in the UK, Paul Oakenfold, and so on and so on. And I thought this is completely ridiculous. I mean. So I found out that they really needed to have this structure to kind of, they somewhat needed a leader, actually. They needed a person to be a representative of a certain territorial culture, someone that is the mouthpiece or at least the model of what they were doing, So I still don't believe it's really necessary, but it still exists in Europe and outside of America. We do it a little bit differently here. So,
Now, I guess related to that, obviously, like the live performance of techno is crucial to its understanding. I think that the development of that live performance and has kind of led to maybe a pattern or an infrastructure that's probably developed in the last 15 years or what have you. At this point, given that there can be sort of a really repetitive structure to what goes on, how live performance is presented to an audience. Is there something you find that you think might be limiting about that structure, or that needs to be reevaluated?
Well, I mean, what has been created is it's I suppose it's the easiest structure. I suppose. I mean, the basic structure is to hire. Well, I can break it down for you, and the basic structure is to hire a international DJ or a DJ from another country to play with local DJs, and maybe a live act, which is actually someone bringing in equipment to perform for a crowd. The setting is typically a very bare room with maybe visual images, video, or some type of stationary hanging type of visual. If you're lucky, maybe dancers or some type of fire show, and that's it. That's the structure. That's the basic structure, and it doesn't go very far out of that structure. On average, I do about 100, 180, 190 parties a year, and that is the basic structure of what we have. Could we go out of that structure or maybe develop it much more? Yes, I think so. And I think in time, as electronic music artists and multimedia artists, they merge more and exchange ideas. I think then we'll begin to see very different settings, I think. I thought that maybe for a long time it would have to do with technology, but I think it's actually more so the merging of art forms, I think, that actually will make something different from what we have now.
And real briefly, you'd also earlier been speaking with the Burden Brothers about how the structure seems to, that you were finding it limiting even just as far as what kind of performance the actual DJs could give a crowd at that point, or within such a lineup.
Yeah, I think that I mean it's really only been, you know, a little over 10 years, you know, of the whole idea of the traveling DJ or the traveling electronic music artist. It's only been about a little over a decade, you know, and half of that decade was basically spent in the studio developing what techno, you know, the techno that we have today, you know, discovering minimalism and discovering trance music and drum and bass and you know, trip hop and all types of different, you know, derivatives and things like that. So so we're actually kind of at the beginning of discovering what is possible, what is really needed, what is not needed. A lot of us are becoming of age where we're not looked at as young kids anymore, that we actually have things in common with people that are curators of museums and galleries and things like that, and who are, you know, production managers and producers of TV shows and things like that. So it, I mean, that was actually a big problem in the early 90s. I think the generation gaps were actually too wide. So we were looked down upon as, you know, these rebellious young kids who were, you know, dancing in the streets, and they're much different from an older generation. But now it's beginning to close in. So more opportunities actually coming for this genre of music. And I think that in time, somewhere in the near future, I would think that we should begin to see electronic music artists trying to exert more of their character through art, or at least trying to show more what techno sounds like, actually. And I think it's just a matter of time. I think that we basically mastered the fundamentals of electronic music and how to produce it, and it really advances just slightly ahead of what we're given in terms of technology. But in terms of theory, what one is supposed to do and what one, you know, is possible, I think that we should begin to see those things evolve much more.
A real development of that idea, of theories, in other words. You also, I think when one starts looking at your work in depth a bit, you can quickly recognize that there's a lot of theory or conceptual framework behind it. Is it at all frustrating for you to have your work looked at outside of that, whatever the conceptual framework might be for a project?
Well, I mean, I started, wow, I mean, I've been conceptualizing with music for a very, very, very long time. Even before I'd ever came to Europe, it was my job to actually produce radio shows. When I was the Wizard here in Detroit, it was my job to produce a radio show every night, 6 days a week, twice a night, and each show had to be different. So I learned at a very early age to play with music and to kind of group it together in terms of a theme or some type of concept. And when I began to produce music, it just naturally carried over into that. So I had always begun, I always kind of looked at music as a vehicle to be able to explain some type of place or event or thing or a psychological state or whatever. And at times it's frustrating that I get indications from people that they would only prefer to have a particular style of music. And it's difficult for me to understand why someone would not want to have a variety or different options in terms of music. This is, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's how I grew up. Maybe it's growing up here in Detroit, where listening to the radio you could listen to very good rock and roll, to very good gospel, to very good art, rhythm and blues, to whatever. And it's puzzling to me that someone would only want to hear a particular type of music all the time. I don't think I can do anything all the time, for long periods of time, I think. So it's kind of strange that someone comes up to me and they go, your latest works are okay. They're not really for the dance floor, but I don't really care for that. I much care for the more hard driving material, and I don't know. It's just kind of puzzling to me. So I try to make the music as diverse as I possibly can for those people that just are music lovers, not someone that just wants to dance all night. So, and it's always been that way. I mean, even through Underground Resistance to going back to Final Cut to, I mean, if you look at the material that I've made ever since the beginning, it was always diverse. So I just assume that someone that comes up to me that would see something like that probably just came in contact with the music that I make, or just came in contact with techno or electronic music, and they don't quite understand that it's not one particular sound or pace or BPM or drum machine or whatever, that it encompasses many different styles and forms. And that's what I encounter.
Do you think techno could expand its range more, or people's understanding of its range, if it were embraced in concept more than it usually is? Beyond the music, in other words?
Well, I think that it really has a lot to do with how tolerant the people are for listening to things that they're not quite familiar with. How tolerant the media is to report something on something that isn't the agenda of the month or what is trendy at that time. And it involves patience for someone to just listen to something where they're not quite sure what the outcome is going to be. It takes those things to happen for something to evolve. And I mean, you can have an army of producers making very innovative music, but if no one takes the time to really listen to it and then acknowledge it and say, hey, there's something very special about it, then we really have no chance. This is what I know has happened, for house music to disco, to techno, so I think it's a very important event that has to happen. I think is acknowledgement.
And with respect to trying to place techno somewhere in between art and entertainment, I wondered if you thought contemporary art in general today was inherently a form of entertainment, and if so, does that leave the door open for techno to be considered a very contemporary art form?
Well, if you compare the two, I mean, they're both vehicles and means for one to be able to communicate. It's if you look at a painting and you listen to electronic techno composition, the intent is generally the same. I mean, someone chose to use blue paint instead of gray, or someone chose to play certain keys, black keys, as opposed to white keys. I mean, there is intent there in both situations, and so it's the process of someone trying to communicate through a format, and I think that they actually are basically the same. I mean, it's basically the same. When you break them down, it's just a form of communication. So, entertainment is one application. Education is also another one. Education and awareness, and many other applications as well.
Also, I guess with respect to that answer, what do you say to those who want to engage with the music, but not necessarily with the concept? In terms of conceptual? I guess in terms of, conceptual. For those who want to engage with techno music, but not necessarily the concept that's starting to emerge here that you have to offer for techno.
Well, the thing is that, I mean, when you really break it down, any effort to communicate through sound or through color or through any type of format is conceptual, actually. Some are more defined than others. Some are more detailed than others. But, I mean, when someone makes a composition, whether it be trance music or drum and bass or techno or house or whatever, and they give it a name, there is an idea behind it. I mean, if there wasn't, then there would be no reason to give it a title, or there would be no reason to only make it at the time limit that it's at, 5 minutes as opposed to 15 minutes. There is some structure. It's just undeveloped concepts, basically, is what it is. So it's when someone has an idea and they make the transition from what they think to their fingers to the keyboard to capturing it on tape or CD, there is a concept there.
And as we, assuming that at this point that techno is more than just music to you, as techno music is often heard, so that in other words, techno may be a theory or maybe a way of life or whatever the case. What else would you say that techno is in order to relate your feelings to us? Is it architecture? Is it like a theme that runs through a book, or is it too much to call it a philosophy? How far are you willing to stretch the comparisons?
My experience, it changes. The form of it changes for what it actually I can basically describe anything or use electronic music or techno as a format to exert any type of idea or any type of feeling. For example, I just finished a project called The Healing Channel, and it's using electronic music as a therapy, actually. So using the same equipment, the same drum machines, the same keyboards that I would normally make a track for someone to dance to on the night, using that same equipment to make something that creates a very gyrating massage type of sound for completely different application. So it really depends on what I need it for. It's kind of like an all-purpose type of format. I never really thought of it as a structured tool where I can't bend it to serve my purpose. So it's always been like that from the beginning. I never looked at it as something that I go to, but something that I kind of create around me, and the most techno thing about everything is, or the most techno thing about the music that I make is actually not in the keyboards or the machines that I use, but it's actually more in the idea of it itself. So I never really relied on a particular sound or a particular keyboard or one that does a particular thing, because I'm shaping the sound for my need.
Mm-hmm. So then, how did something that I think what I'm understanding is it has such a mutability, maybe an elasticity to it. Do you feel that it's chosen a very rigid path for in a short-term history, or?
No, I think it. I mean, I suppose, rigid. I suppose that would probably be I don't know, maybe the first 4 years. I suppose. I mean, not the first 4 years, but maybe the late 80s to the mid 90s, I suppose. And it was rigid because it was the era of acid house and the era of heavy drugs, ecstasy, and the very circus-like atmosphere of electronic music. And it was rigid because you at times have situations where young people are doing things that they're not supposed to be doing. So you have the authorities and city officials and the police trying to control the situation. So it was rigid because of that. But through the 90s, it began to take on a much wider form, and people begin to not rebel, but they were interested in producing music in another direction. So shortly after Acid House, a very short phase came where people were producing very intellectual type of electronic music, and groups like Black Dog and Aphex Twin, and a lot of groups from the UK and things from Germany were actually coming in. It was more towards art form and tinkering with machines and modifications and things like that, and things became a little bit more stabilized. The whole party scene became a little bit more settled. The structure of the whole industry in Europe and outside of America became a little bit more form came about, and it became easier to travel around countries and play music for people and perform and things like that. So.
And when you speak also of, I guess, the way in which you're able to apply techno to far beyond, say, a studio setting or DJ, far beyond the context of music, really. I think, and do you see that as a future for maybe people who aren't even making, for techno in general, for it to expand beyond a musical form,
yeah, it really,
for it to have other avenues it can go, considering it is meant to be about immutability and willingness to explore.
I think
try things.
It really has to do with something that I believe it really has to do with how other things influence a younger generation of people outside of music. How a younger generation grows up and what their influences are, and how the world and everything in the world is really affecting them, actually. And I think as they grow up, as they become older, they have a certain view on life, I think. For me, I mean, I I grew up in the 60s. It was a very turbulent time, especially here in Detroit. You know, riots in Chicago, riots in Detroit,
Yeah.
Watts riots. You know, the civil rights movement. So I can remember, you know, the army coming into Detroit and stabilizing the whole city, and there was fires, you know, just like one block away, and my parents thought it was too dangerous, and they took us to Montreal, to Canada at that time, because it was just too violent to be here in the city. And at the time, I don't know if it was just by coincidence, but it was actually Expo in Montreal, 1967. And while all this was happening here in Detroit, you know, I was being exposed to how people were actually dreaming about what tomorrow would be like. And we stayed there for maybe 2 weeks until things calmed down here, and then they brought us back here to Detroit, you know, you know, I mean, just growing up in that era and watching how the city kind of recovered from that and the state that it's in now, and watching the automobile industry kind of decline and then stabilize, and what's left from, you know, what remnants are left from that era, and listening to the ideas of what people plan to do to kind of fix it and patch it up and move on from here. Those you know, growing up in these type of eras, it shapes a particular type of character, and I suppose all of us, you know, the techno community here in Detroit, we have similarities. We grew up, most of us grew up in this era, so deep down within ourselves, there are similarities and probably the same reasons why we make music the same way or very similar ways, or why we have such an urge to want to leave the city of Detroit and kind of bring the sound with us and show other people what it's like, you know, or what we've kind of experienced, the type of people that we are, so I would think that the same thing would happen to a younger generation, and that will kind of shape what the music will be like, what they'll use, what they will find interest in, the type of messages they'll put in the music. And I think that's generally how it works throughout time.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you were just talking about being in a situation where you had people thinking about tomorrow, and I think in a simple form, if not too simplistic, I think of techno as being, you know, a series of guesses about tomorrow, and thinking about, you know, there is that emphasis on tomorrow, and I think there have been generations of people who have grown up thinking about tomorrow with the 21st century being a sort of a benchmark maybe of that thought process. Now that we're here, do you think people, maybe younger people, are still thinking about tomorrow? Is it a different process?
I want to say yes, but honestly, I would probably have to say no. I mean, I think that the world, you know, has become more complex. There are more. It's a very complex world that we all live in today, and I think the average young person is exposed to so many much more harsher things in life, I think. I mean, when you turn on the news and you listen to just the nightly news and, you know, the things that you hear like in 1 week, I mean, within 24 hours, or, you know, it can just be drastically different. After a while, it really shapes one's character and how one views the world. And I've always just kind of discovered that it's hard to get people to discuss the future. Actually, I've always found that it's hard to get in conversations with people about the future and what they think the future may be like. It's almost to a certain extent where people find it kind of disturbing to discuss. Whether some people want not to kind of make a prediction and then it doesn't happen, or maybe some people may have views on the future that maybe it's too bleak, or I find that people are not as optimistic in these days than, I suppose, maybe in the 90s, I suppose. I've always found it difficult, and even through making music, I find it difficult for people to really accept a concept or a story or some type of idea that takes place in the future, and the music is actually asking the listener to kind of imagine in the situation or the scenario.